If I asked you whether you'd like to see your country's airport handling more flights, welcoming more visitors, and staying busy or not, you'd probably say, "Of course we want that. Who wouldn't?" But I'll tell you this, the Dutch government currently rejects that idea. Last year, the Dutch government announced a cap on the number of annual flights at their main airport, with plans to reduce that number even further. And here, we ask, how is this possible? Most countries wish for their airports to expand and operate more, but the Netherlands doesn't. This has created a major issue for the airport. To address it, the government decided to spend 25 million euros to buy around 10 farms. You might wonder, what does this have to do with the airport? I'll explain. They're buying these farms to shut them down. And they're not the only ones doing this. Other parties, including the Dutch government itself, plan to shut down thousands of farms in the near future. So, what's the story? What's the connection between the airport, the farms, and the livestock? Why does the government want to close thousands of farms? And if these farms are closed, how will the country make up for the shortage of milk, cheese, and meat? Will they start importing these products, even though they're a significant part of the Dutch economy? Also, what role does Bill Gates play in all of this? Why has there been such outrage among the Dutch over the past 3 years, leading to hostile actions against Bill Gates? That's what we'll try to understand today. So, before diving into the details of the story, I hope you subscribe to help us reach 500 subscribers by the end of this month. Also, if you'd like to support me in creating content in 4K, I'll leave all my account bank links in the description box, and without further ado, let's get started. On October 1st, 2019, Dutch farmers held large protests. About 2,000 tractors showed up on highways, bringing traffic to a standstill. A few weeks later, tensions between the government and the farmers escalated, prompting thousands of farmers to gather in front of the parliament in The Hague, once again using tractors to block roads and disrupt government work. These protests have become an annual occurrence, with the latest ones taking place just a few months ago in a similar fashion. The reason for these protests is the government's decision to cut nitrogen emissions by over 50%, aiming to achieve this goal by 2030. For farmers, this means shutting down more than 11,000 farms and ordering over 17,000 others to drastically reduce their livestock by more than 50%. Considering that the Netherlands has around 120 million livestock, imagine how many animals will have to be culled. If you watched the previous episode, you'd know that agriculture and livestock farming are incredibly important to the Dutch people, especially farmers. If you travel to any rural area in the Netherlands, you'll find that farming and livestock breeding aren't just about making money, it's a way of life. Now, imagine the government telling you to get rid of all these animals. The reason for all this is concerns about nitrogen emissions. Here's the question. For all these years, these farms were causing pollution. So why is it being addressed in 2019 specifically? I'll tell you that it didn't actually start in 2019. The government had been discussing the risks of nitrogen emissions for years and taking slow steps to reduce them. But an environmental organization filed a lawsuit, and in 2019, the Dutch Supreme Court ruled that the situation in the country violated EU directives aimed at protecting areas called Natura 2000. These are regions in Europe rich in biodiversity plants, animals, and ecosystems that Europeans want to preserve from pollution, extinction, or destruction. The Netherlands has about 162 of these areas, and if it fails to protect them, it will face significant problems with the European Union. That's why the Dutch government has been working to reduce nitrogen emissions, as they are among the largest contributors to the destruction of these areas. However, before 2019, the government's actions weren't strong enough. After the court's ruling, there was no room for leniency regarding nitrogen emissions, which largely come from agriculture, especially from synthetic fertilizers containing nitrogen, which are highly beneficial for plants. But plants don't absorb all the nitrogen, and the large amounts of animal waste in the Netherlands also contain substantial nitrogen levels. You've also got sectors like construction, aviation, and cars. All of these contribute to nitrogen emissions. To give you an idea of the situation in the Netherlands, let me tell you that the soil there contains 3 times the amount of nitrogen allowed by EU regulations. This excess nitrogen leaks into the environment and nature reserves, polluting both the land and water. For instance, nitrogen can encourage algae growth, and when these algae die and decompose, they consume oxygen from the water, suffocating marine life. Because of this destruction and pollution, the Dutch government is acting fast. First, they've halted construction, roadwork, and other infrastructure projects. They've also reduced highway speed limits from 130 kilometers per hour to 100 kilometers per hour during the day, and imposed a strict annual flight cap on the country's main airport. This is why the airport ended up buying and shutting down several farms to lower nitrogen levels, allowing it to stay within the permitted emission limits. Since farms are the largest source of nitrogen emissions, the Netherlands has decided to shut down thousands of them and cull a significant number of animals. Farmers are expected to comply voluntarily, or the government may seize and close the farms. The government has allocated a $25 billion budget to buy 3,000 farms as an initial step, which has sparked widespread protests among Dutch farmers. These protests have gained support from other parts of Dutch society, because people know they'll be directly affected by the resulting damage. With so many animals and farms gone, how will food prices look? They'll definitely skyrocket, and they're already high due to the Russia-Ukraine war and other crises. Meanwhile, the government, corporations, and some environmental groups are saying there's nothing to worry about. They argue we can rely on alternative protein sources like insects. Yes, insects. They're rich in protein, and we can eat them to solve the food problem. By the way, Bill Gates has also endorsed this idea, and there are groups supporting this shift. But people aren't going to accept it easily. So, these groups and some companies are promoting the idea that we don't need to raise livestock for meat anymore. Instead, we can produce it in labs cultured meat, synthetic meat, or fake meat, as it's called by different names. This is being marketed now, even to farmers, encouraging them to ditch their livestock and join this new wave of lab-grown meat production, eliminating the need for their animals. Now, you might wonder, what exactly is this fake or lab-grown meat? From what I understand, labs take tissue from animals, like cows or pigs, and isolate the stem cells, which have the ability to divide and grow as needed. These cells are then provided with growth solutions that help them multiply and develop inside bioreactors, turning into edible pieces of meat without the need to raise, feed, or care for an entire herd of cows. You only need one cow, or a small number of them, to extract cells, and from those, you can produce a massive amount of meat. This is happening now. It's no longer just a future concept. It's already in practice, with investments pouring into it. The first lab-grown piece of meat appeared in 2013, when Dutch scientists created the world's first lab-grown hamburger, which was actually consumed, as you can see. While selling lab-grown meat is still not legally approved in the Netherlands or Europe, that hasn't stopped the Netherlands from being a global leader in this field. The country is one of the top leaders in agricultural and animal research worldwide, and all these strange ideas originated there. The reason for this is the fully integrated work environment in the Netherlands. The country has very advanced universities, and around these universities, you'll find large companies with specialized research centers. All of this speeds up the introduction of lab-grown meat into the market. But this has made a lot of Dutch people angry, both farmers and regular citizens. And it's not just happening in the Netherlands, it's spread to other European countries too. In fact, Italy had a big debate about it and recently decided to ban the production, consumption, and marketing of lab-grown meat altogether. Italy didn't wait for the EU's decision on these products. It took immediate action and shut the door on them, saying they don't want it. At the same time, the Netherlands has allowed initial tastings of lab-grown meat, though not for sale, just tastings. In the US, however, there are already brands selling lab-grown meat backed by big companies and influential figures like Bill Gates. And hold on, we'll get back to Bill Gates in a moment. But first, let me tell you that the driving force behind this whole thing is actually the big traditional meat companies, the largest meat producers in the world. You might wonder why these companies would support such a shift, knowing it could destroy their profits and core business. Well, from an investment perspective, they see it as necessary to back this movement. They're afraid of fighting against this type of innovation and then being left behind when the industry moves on without them. If lab-grown meat succeeds, traditional meat production could become obsolete. They don't want to end up like what happened to traditional cars with the rise of electric vehicles and declining profits. So, they think it's better to ride the wave early. That's why it's no surprise that the biggest players in the global meat industry are entering this field and investing heavily in the idea they don't want to miss the opportunity. And honestly, this is natural. But as soon as someone unique, like Bill Gates, gets involved, conspiracy theories start popping up out of nowhere. Some people think his interest in this sector isn't just casual, but part of some bigger plan. Despite these theories, Bill Gates has written about this issue, claiming that this approach will protect the environment. He's even called on wealthy nations to fully transition to lab-grown meat. His focus, along with that of big corporations, is on wealthy countries, especially those heavily dependent on agricultural and livestock production. And here we see the two biggest players in this sector, the US and the Netherlands, being the first and largest targets for this rapid shift. As for poorer countries, Bill Gates has acknowledged that transitioning 80 of these nations to lab-grown meat will be tough. It's simply too expensive for them right now, and they can't afford it. So, his focus and that of big corporations remain on wealthy countries. But even in wealthy countries, lab-grown meat will be very expensive when it first hits the market, even after it's approved for sale. So, how can we lower its cost? Well, some argue that prices will naturally drop over time with research and development, but that will take a long time. In the meantime, there are extreme suggestions to raise the price of regular meat, to make lab-grown meat more competitive. That way, consumers would gravitate toward the cheaper lab-grown option. But how do you raise the price of regular meat? It's possible through climate regulations imposed on farmers in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, which is Europe's largest exporter of meat and dairy. With new laws and rules that reduce production by 50%, the price of regular meat will gradually rise. In just a few years, lab-grown meat might become economically competitive with regular meat. And if lab-grown meat doesn't become a more affordable option for the public compared to regular meat, the rising cost of regular meat will encourage investors and big companies to spend even more on research and development, speeding up the process of lowering lab-grown meat prices. Over time, it's very possible that lab-grown meat could become cheaper than regular meat. The Dutch are aware of what's happening around them. So, in an incident about 2 years ago, some Dutch farmers set fire to a warehouse, believing it belonged to one of Bill Gates's lab-grown meat companies. But it turned out that the warehouse was simply storing goods for a Dutch retail chain, nothing more. This shows how much the traditional meat industry fears these ideas. That's why the advocates for lab-grown meat believe it's essential to win over farmers, ease their fears, and get them involved in the production process so they can profit as well. Without farmers, this type of meat won't spread quickly. Plus, the production process depends on cells taken from live animals owned by these farmers. So now, There are initiatives encouraging farmers to convert their farms or parts of them into lab-grown meat production. These initiatives even offer full funding for the expensive reactors and production units. They tell farmers, "We'll cover the costs with an easy installment plan," which helps get farmers on board instead of facing protests and demonstrations. This also makes them look good in the eyes of environmental groups and public opinion, as people see them as helping the environment and reducing nitrogen emissions. This, in turn, allows the government to operate other sectors like construction, transportation, and airports without restrictions. This story is unfolding in the Netherlands and might soon spread to other European and wealthy countries. You might feel conflicted because the idea of lab-grown meat is hard to accept. But let's set emotions aside and think logically. Let's look at who supports these ideas, and why, and who's against them, and what their concerns are. Supporters of the idea say we'll need massive food production in the coming years to meet the demands of a growing population that could reach 9.7 billion by 2050. Most of this growth depends on meat consumption. According to the United Nations, between 80 and 92 billion animals are currently consumed annually for meat, and we'll need far more to feed 10 billion people by 2050. But the problem is that livestock today accounts for 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, uses up 26% of the Earth's surface area, and consumes 8% of total fresh water. With current pollution levels and limited planetary resources, we won't be able to meet this rising demand using traditional meat production methods. Supporters argue that transitioning to lab-grown meat is essential. According to one study, lab-grown meat could reduce global warming by 92%, cut air pollution by 93%, use 95% less land, and needs 78% less water compared to traditional beef. They also claim lab-grown meat is free from growth hormones and genetic modifications, which some companies use to increase productivity. Unlike traditional meat, lab-grown meat is said to be healthier and doesn't require antibiotics for animals. That's the general argument from supporters and their main focus, which is on environmental conservation. On the other hand, opponents are completely skeptical and worried. Some argue that if lab-grown meat is meant to protect the environment and reduce global warming, that's not accurate at all. They believe it will require massive amounts of energy, possibly from fossil fuels, which harms the environment. Even if clean energy is used, production would need huge infrastructure to supply clean energy for feeding such a massive population. This would require raw materials, most of which would come from the earth, leading to even more environmental destruction. According to a study from the University of California, the carbon footprint of lab-grown meat could be 4 to 25 times worse than that of beef. Many other studies also warn about its environmental impact. In the end, the topic of lab-grown meat is vast and complicated, and much about it remains unknown. But what's striking is how the Dutch plan to simply give up their livestock and exports in a field where they're considered a global leader. This raises questions about these recent decisions. If you knew how the Netherlands achieved this position over the years, you'd be surprised. If you're curious about how the Dutch turned salty sea into drinkable water and farmland, and how this small country became a giant in agriculture and livestock production, check out the previous episode linked above or in the description box. If you've made it to the end of this video, please help us get closer to 500 subscribers by subscribing. See you in the next episode, and thanks.